In July of 2022, New York City's emergency management aired this PSA.
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do we do? What do we do? What do we do?
As you can imagine, it caused a bit of chaos, leaving most people wondering, why now? Many younger New Yorkers claim they felt unprepared, but older generations might actually remember what to do. That's because in New York City alone, there were close to 18,000 identified fallout shelters, many hidden in plain sight. But how would these shelters hold up today? And was building them all for nothing? Our story starts in the 1960s. Tensions were high between the US and the former USSR amid the ongoing Cold War. So the Kennedy administration emphasized to Americans that threats of a nuclear attack needed to be taken seriously, and Americans needed to be ready. Enter the Fallout Shelter program. Former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller also strongly advocated for the implementation of fallout shelters. It's rumored that he had one built into at least 4 of his residences, including the governor's mansion. Rockefeller focused on his own separate statewide efforts for funding these programs, even before Kennedy took office. Despite wanting to make shelters a mandatory program, he was only able to pass it through the state legislature as voluntary, with a fraction of his proposed budget in 1961. And even then, it was met with controversy. And it was after Rockefeller met with Kennedy in 1961 did President Kennedy address Congress for a need of a civil defense program, which, you guessed it, included both private and public shelter construction. But more on that later. In 2017, these signs denoting fallout shelter locations in the city were taken down for being, quote, misleading. To explain why, we're going to visit one here in the trendy neighborhood of Soho at 459 West Broadway. So here we are on West Broadway. Looks like any old New York City street. You got your galleries, your restaurants, but then if you come here, you got this sign.
I'm Jeff Slugamelch. I'm the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Climate School.
Or as I like to call him, a fallout shelter expert. The building here is 6 stories, housing both businesses and residences. It's also a pre-war construction, meaning the building was built before World War II. These buildings are known to be made out of very thick materials. So why is this a good spot for a fallout shelter?
So just looking at this building from the outside, you can already see that there's a lot of thick layers of brick and concrete between you and the outside world. And that's really what you want. You want something to put a lot of both distance but also heavy, dense material between you and any radioactive particles on the outside. And this is really important, especially for some of the more intense gamma radiation. There are different kinds of radiation that might come off of the isotopes from the explosion. And basically the thicker the concrete, the thicker the brick between you and the outside world, the more protection that offers. And there's a lot of buildings like that around here, and that's partly probably why you saw so many sort of identified as good spots because of the materials that they're made of.
Most of these shelters were located in the building basements and sometimes stocked with supplies. These supplies were accounted for roughly $2.40 per person.
You gotta think about, bathrooms, you gotta think about first aid kits, you gotta think about food, you gotta think about medicine. And in some of these shelters you'd find cots, you'd find sleeping areas, and you'd also find air filters, so things that you can do manually to kind of refresh the air and get fresh air in there at the same time.
But not all shelters were created equal. While some were kept tidy, others fell into disarray. By 1963, the Army Corps of Engineers identified sites that could accommodate over 11 million New Yorkers. But that, in itself, was an issue.
This was a little controversial too, because how do you do that in a city like New York? What population are you expecting to have the attack be during the day when you have a lot more people in Manhattan, or in the evening when people are back in the boroughs? And so you might actually have shelters overcrowded in some areas and completely empty in other areas.
But in the midst of this shelter building boom, criticism emerged that the government was focused on the wrong thing. Why? Because there wasn't any proof that people in these shelters could survive.
In the early days, when we're thinking about, well, if there's an explosion and you're not in the blast radius, you can get somewhere safe to save yourself from the radiation. The scenario changed, where you just weren't going to get out of the blast radius. The explosions were too big and the weapons were too numerous. And the question really came up, is this going to give us anything other than just a false sense of security?
But the end of the fallout shelter program didn't come as a surprise to some, as controversy was always there. Scientists and academics criticized the program from the start. Criticisms ranged from socioeconomic and racial inequalities to the idea that this preparedness might heighten more tensions, to the psychological effects of being trapped in a windowless room, to even disputing the efficacy of the shelters themselves. And remember how in the beginning we told you Kennedy met with the strong shelter proponent Rockefeller? Well, it's been suggested that Kennedy wanted to appear tough on the issue, especially since Rockefeller was looked at as a formidable future opponent. Federal funding for these shelters ended in the 70s, as FEMA assumed responsibility for civil defense. And so the program, and all of approximately New York City's 18,000 shelters, largely fell into disrepair. More recently, in 2017, many of the remaining signs in the 5 boroughs located on municipal and public buildings like schools were taken down for being, quote, misleading. Can we talk about why some people labeled these signs as misleading?
Yeah, it's similar to North Korea testing nuclear weapons. There was a lot of attention towards these fallout shelters. And you see one of these signs and you're hearing about nuclear attacks, you're thinking this might be a place I can go. There's most likely no shelter behind these signs anymore.
So now that the fear, warranted or not, of nuclear war is on the rise, where should New Yorkers turn? Is it even worth having a plan? So is there any chance we survive a nuclear attack?
Yes, with a caveat. So there are a lot of variables. So if we're talking full-scale nuclear war with thousands of missiles going back and forth between major nuclear powers, probably not. If we're talking about a nuclear terrorist attack, a suitcase nuke, something that would take out a few city blocks, that is a very, very survivable situation if you're not in the initial blast. If you're in the initial blast radius, sorry, I can't help you. But if you're outside of that, if you're near the blast, if you see the blast, then you have a good 10 to 20 minutes where all of this material has been kicked up into the air and is up above you and is going to start working its way down. That's where we can save a lot of lives by getting a lot of people in a dense area like this inside.
So what do we do when we see the mushroom cloud? We get inside.
We try to put as much distance between us and the outside as possible. If we're in a building like this with a lot of concrete, with a lot of brick, even better. If you're close to the roof, you want to come down a few floors because you'll have a lot of radioactive material settling on the roof. You want to create some distance between that. The best place is generally in the basement. That's where you have the most sort of buffers between you and the outside world. But if you can't get to the basement, come down a few floors. Being more in the middle of the building, in the center of the building, offers a fair degree of protection as well. You want to turn off any sort of air conditioners or things that are going to be pulling in air from the outside. Right off the bat, changing your clothes can get rid of 80% of the contamination that you have on you. If you have the ability to rinse off, take a shower, even better. Put it in a plastic bag. We recommend double bagging, setting aside. And then you're sitting there, you're hanging out for a good 12, 24 hours. You're going to want a radio or some way of getting in touch with the outside world so you have information on when it's safe to evacuate.
So after those 24 hours, does it get okay to go out into the outside world again?
So for the purposes of evacuation, it becomes a lot safer, but it's not necessarily someplace where you're able to move back in or plant your crops or something like that. There's going to be some residual radiation. It's actually a much tougher question to answer on when it's safe to reoccupy, but for immediate life safety, it becomes orders of magnitude safer to evacuate.
And as for that PSA, Jeff says it's a good start.
The kind of nuclear threats we're looking at now are not total global annihilation. That threat's still there, so you can still lay awake at night worried about that. But we also have this other threat of nuclear terrorism, of smaller nation states with maybe just a few nuclear weapons, sneaking one in. So we're looking at 1 or 2 or a small number of nuclear detonations of a smaller scale. That is a much more survivable circumstance.
He adds that most people could hunker down in buildings, whether it be a place of work or their home, for about 12 to 24 hours until conditions are safer for further evacuation. Because, let's be real, nuclear preparedness is never an easy topic of conversation, and New Yorkers are clearly much more interested in the topic. So in case you need another reminder, let's play that PSA again.
There are 3 important steps that I want you to remember. Step 1, get inside fast. Step 2, stay inside. Shut all doors and windows. Step 3, stay tuned. Follow media for more information. Don't forget to sign up for Notify NYC for official alerts and updates.